Have you ever wondered what the meaning of your life is? Viktor Frankl founded an entire school of psychotherapy on this question called logotherapy. And this is the book that started it all, Man's Search for Meaning. Grab your favorite drink, make yourself comfortable. Today we'll take a look at that. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and today I've got another book review for you. Today we're going to take a look at Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Frankl was a neurologist and psychiatrist, and he is the founder of logotherapy that aims to help patients find meaning in their lives. Frankl was a Jewish scholar, and during the Third Reich he was imprisoned in concentration camps for multiple years. And after his liberation he wrote a book about his experiences in the concentration camps, and now things get a bit complicated. The book was first published in Austria in 1946 under the title Ein Psychologe erlebt das Konzentrationslager, literally a psychologist experiences the concentration camp. However, it wasn't very successful. But in 1959 it was released in the USA, first under the title From Death Camp to Existentialism. And it was very successful. It received several reprints and the title was changed to Man's Search for Meaning. There were also additional chapters added. First, by request of his readers, Frankl added a short description of logotherapy called Logotherapy in a Nutshell. And a couple of years later, he added a postscript called The Case for a Tragic Optimism. After its success in the USA, the book was also republished in Germany, this time under the title Trotzdem Ja zum Leben sagen, saying yes to life despite of everything. And this time it was also quite successful in Germany and became a bestseller. This new German edition does not include the additional chapters from Man's Search for Meaning. Instead, it includes a short play written by Frankl that deals with two brothers who are imprisoned at the concentration camp Birkenwald and who find meaning. And so you see, it's a bit complicated. We have a German and an English edition. We have two different titles for each, and we have different contents. And to make matters worse, I noticed there is also an English book by Frankl with the title Saying Yes to Life in Spite of Everything, advertised as being from the author of Man's Search for Meaning. So supposedly it's different, and yeah, I have no idea what that is about. But what I can tell you is that Man's Search for Meaning is a very important and foundational book that a lot of other authors used and referred to. For example, Stephen Covey refers to Frankl in his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People several times and quotes him and mentions his theories. So what are those theories? Let's have a look. In his description of his life in the concentration camps, Frankl describes the full cycle from his first admission to his liberation. And he describes how inmates react to the life in the camp. And he describes that in the first phase, in the admission and the time after the admission, this time is marked by shock and by clinging to hope and then disillusionment. The phase of the actual camp life, daily routine in the camp, this is marked by apathy. By apathy and by aggression that is partly caused by undernourishment and lack of sleep. And also this undernourishment and lack of sleep and daily struggle for survival causes people to kind of regress to the most basic needs. Frankl describes how food is the main topic of conversation among the inmates, how inmates dream of things like a decent meal or a warm bath, and how they lose interest in everything except for politics and religion. For obvious reason, politics, because a turn of the war to their advantage might mean they get liberated, and religion because death is present in everyday life. For the third phase, liberation, Frankl describes how the inmates who are liberated at first can't grasp and can't understand the situation. They kind of know they were supposed to be happy, but they don't have any feeling at all, and it takes hours or even days until they really realize the situation. And he describes bitterness and disappointment for those who finally return home. Bitterness because by their surroundings, by the people in their surroundings, they are often greeted with empty phrases such as "we didn't know anything" or "we had to suffer as well." And he describes the severe disappointment a lot of former inmates had to go through, because in their time in the camp, a lot of them hoped that one day they would return home and they would be greeted by their wives and their children, and most of them had to realize that no one was waiting for them anymore because the people that they had loved had all been murdered. The biggest part of Frankl's description deals with the actual camp life, the daily routine in the camps. And here, the most important aspect is the struggle for meaning, because Frankl describes how those who lost all meaning, who didn't have goals anymore, who didn't have anything to hold on to anymore, how they despaired and died. Some of them committed suicide by walking into the electrocuted barbed wire fence. Some of them just succumbed to apathy. They didn't get up anymore in the morning. They just kept lying on the floor. And Frankl describes how they often got a cigarette from some hiding place in their clothing and started smoking it. And this was something an inmate usually wouldn't do, because cigarettes were quite valuable and you could exchange them for a bowl of soup. So if you started actually smoking the cigarettes, that meant you had given up all hope, and people knew they would watch their comrade die during the next couple of days. So Frankl emphasizes how important it is to have some sense of meaning, to still have some goals. He quotes Nietzsche, who said, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." And for Frankl, there are three ways to meaning. And the first is by creating something or by achieving something. And for Frankl, this is also very important, because when he was admitted to Auschwitz, he had to give away all his possessions, his luggage, his clothing even. and in his jacket he had a manuscript for what was supposed to become his first book about logotherapy. And after he had lost that manuscript, he had always hoped that one day he would be able to rewrite that book and to publish it. And there is also a scene that is well known and that is often referred to, where Frankl, in pain and suffering, imagines being in a big, warm, brightly lit room where he is standing in front at a podium and there is an audience listening to him, and he holds a lecture about his experiences and observations in the concentration camp. The second approach to meaning is by experiencing something or by encountering someone. And here love is a very important aspect. And this as well holds true also for Frankl, because he describes multiple times how he, in times of pain and suffering, brings up the image of his mind in his thoughts, and how he imagines talking to her, and how he is with her in his thoughts. And now, obviously, the people in the concentration camps, the inmates, were devoid of any means to achieve or create something or to experience something. Sorry. So they usually said, I hope we survive this. I hope we get out of this camp one day, because if we don't, if we die here, then all the suffering will have had no meaning. And Frankl turned this around. He said, I hope the suffering has meaning, because if it doesn't, it would be useless to survive. There must be more to life than merely that it goes on. And for Frankl, there is even meaning in suffering. Because even in suffering, there remains what Frankl calls the last freedom of man. The freedom, even if you are under conditions where you can't do anything, where you are suffering, where you don't have any options or potentials, that you are still able to decide how you will approach these conditions, how you will feel towards these conditions, how you will behave towards these conditions. Because Frankl believes that man is self-determined. He says there are a lot of things that push us in a certain direction, such as biological factors like our genes, or psychological factors like our childhood, or social factors like our surroundings. But we still decide whether we allow ourselves to be pushed or whether we fight against it. We still get to decide how to deal with those conditions. Frankl says the meaning of life is not so much something that humans ask of life, but it is something that life asks of us. He says that each person in each specific situation is facing potentials and challenges, and it's up to us to take responsibility and rise up to those challenges and actualize those potentials. There is a thing that I found difficult to grasp in this context, because Frankl also mentions that in the concentration camp, he wasn't trying to change his fate. He wasn't trying to turn his fate into a certain direction. He just accepted his fate as it came to him. For example, he mentions how he thought up a plan to flee from the camp together with a comrade, but in the end he decided not to go through with it, not to try to change his fate. An interesting thing is Frankl also briefly refers to the camp guards, and despite all his suffering, he doesn't collectively blame and condemn them. He says there were good exceptions among the guards, just as there were bad exceptions among the inmates. And as an example, he describes a situation in the camp he was in before being liberated. And in this camp there was a so-called capo, an inmate who had been promoted to a higher position, so he was in control of some other inmates, and this capo was frequently beating the other inmates, and he was violent towards them. And at the same time there was a camp leader, someone from the SS, who, as Frankl says, never raised his hand against an inmate, and as was later found out, had frequently purchased medicine for the inmates for large sums of his own money. So Frankl says there are only two races in the world, the decent people and the indecent people, and each group also always includes some of both. As I mentioned before, Man's Search for Meaning includes the additional chapter Logotherapy in a Nutshell, which I found quite interesting and helpful because here Frankl further explains and describes some of the concepts from his concentration camp experiences. For example, he explains that the lack of meaning in one's life is not merely an individual problem, but it is a problem of society. He says that each generation has its own collective neurosis, and in our time this is an existential vacuum, a lack of meaning in life. He also further describes his concept of meaning. I mentioned before that for Frankl, meaning is not some lofty concept, but it is very specific to a person and specific to a situation. And here Frankl gives a nice metaphor. He says asking, what is the meaning of life? Is like asking a chess master, what is the best move in the world? Obviously, the chess master will say, yeah, well, that depends on the game I play, the situation on the board, and the person I'm playing against. And in the same way, the meaning of life is specific to a person and a situation, and it changes permanently. Another interesting aspect is that searching for meaning means self-transcendence. Frankl says we don't find meaning in ourselves, in our own psyche, in our own thoughts. We find it in the world outside. We find it when we transcend ourselves. And he also mentions that it is not desirable to get rid of all tension, to achieve a tensionless state where everything is achieved and there is nothing to strive for anymore. But it is actually desirable to always have a certain tension from goals we strive for but have not yet achieved. He also provides further explanations for his 3 ways to meaning, and he gives a nice example for meaning through suffering. An old man came into his practice who was suffering from severe depressions. His wife, whom he had loved deeply, had died a couple of years ago, and he was mourning, and he was all alone, and he was suffering. And Frankl asked him, if you would have been the one who had died and your wife had survived, what would the situation have been like? And the old man said, oh, that would have been dreadful for her. She would have suffered a lot, she would have been all alone, and she would have mourned for me. And so Frankl said, because you are the one who has survived, because you are the one who carries this burden now. Your wife doesn't have to carry it. Your wife doesn't have to go through this suffering. And this helped the man to find meaning in his suffering and to find worth in his suffering. There is a concept that is somewhat difficult but still important. Frankl says we should live as if we were living already for the second time, and as if the first time we had done everything as wrong as we are about to do now. I had to reread that sentence a couple of times and I still find it difficult to grasp. I believe it is the same concept that is described in a better way, for example, by Covey later, who says we should imagine being a guest at our own funeral and hearing what our family members and friends and colleagues say about our lives. Speaking about death and transitoriness, Frankl has an interesting concept here. He says we tend to see only the stubble fields of transitoriness, but we overlook the full granaries of the past. Frankl says that only potentials are transitory. Once we have realized the potentials in a situation, they become realities and they move into the past where no one can take them away from us anymore, where we will keep them forever. And he puts great value on this full granary of the past that contains our deeds done, our experiences we have experienced, and sufferings we have bravely gone through. Another thing I found interesting is that Frankl says that nowadays therapists are often approached with problems that are not so much psychological problems, but human problems. And he says that in earlier times, people would have probably approached a priest or a rabbi with those, but since this isn't usually done anymore, they often approach a therapist. And I found this idea interesting, that there is this need for this kind of help and support, that we don't really have a default person or institution to go to nowadays. As I mentioned before, we also have the postscript, the case for the tragic optimism. However, it would be excessive to discuss that one as well. It is already going to be a rather long video, so let me just say that Frankl gives some further explanations about his concepts, shows up some additional aspects. I found it interesting as well, but as I said, it would be excessive to go into more detail here. Instead, let's continue to some criticism. There is some controversy surrounding Frankl and his autobiographical account in here. For example, how historically accurate his descriptions are. And I'm afraid I can't really comment on that, because this would require an amount of research I am not able to do here. Similarly, there is, of course, the question whether it is appropriate to use the Holocaust as a setting to describe your theories. And again, I am not the appropriate person to judge that. The book is more difficult to read than other soft skill books. If we compare it to The Why Cafe by John Strzelecki, The Why Cafe also contains a story, but it is an imaginary story. And in The Why Cafe, every word, every sentence is designed to further establish Strzelecki's ideas and theories and teachings. Everything falls neatly into place. And here in Frankl's book, since it is a description of his experiences, things don't fall into place so easily. I mentioned before this aspect of accepting fate and not changing fate that I found difficult. A similar problematic aspect is that in the earlier sections of his experiences, Frankl mentions that the best did not return from the concentration camps, that the people who were decent and good and who wouldn't try to gain an advantage at the expense of other people, that those didn't survive the camp. And this is a bit difficult in the context of what he later says, that finding meaning, actualizing the last human freedom, that this helped people survive. And there he speaks of shining examples who were able to fight against apathy and aggression, and to be shining examples for everyone. And this is difficult to grasp. By the way, speaking about shining examples, it is noteworthy that Frankl doesn't count himself among those. He doesn't make himself into a role model in this book. He rather takes the position of, I'd say, an observer. We have the topic of self-determination here, which is quite a complex and quite a difficult topic. Because if we say those who found meaning and who actualized the last human freedom, those were able to face the suffering and to survive the camp, of course we can turn this around and say, oh well, those who died, they probably didn't try hard enough to find meaning. They probably didn't actualize the last human freedom. Yeah, well, the Nazis imprisoned them and tortured them and used them for slave labor and everything. But what killed them, that was their inability to find meaning. And of course, this would be excessively cynical and wrong. And this is not just a difficulty of this specific context, but it is inherent to this whole idea of self-determination. We can't go into more detail here, but since this idea of self-determination is quite common in soft skills, we will discuss it further in future videos. I mentioned multiple times that logotherapy in a nutshell was quite helpful to me. However, I should also point out that it is extremely condensed and compressed. Frankl himself says that he had to distill 20 volumes in German into this one chapter, and this is what it reads like. There are sections like the essence of existence, and that's a mere 2 pages long, and those 2 pages are packed with information, so it isn't easy to read. Frequently, Frankl will make a statement, and then he won't give an explanation or examples, but he will just move on to something else. So the whole book isn't that easy to read. However, I found it quite an interesting and exciting and inspiring book. There were a lot of interesting ideas, and frequently during reading my mind wandered off, not because I was thinking of something else, but because I had found an interesting idea and I thought about it and I compared it to other concepts or put it into the context of my own life. So it was quite an interesting read for me, and I think I will read the book again when some time has passed, or excerpts of the book in a couple of weeks or months, and I think probably new ideas and new aspects will show up, and it will still be quite interesting. So I certainly recommend the book to you, also because in this video I can only give you a very brief glimpse into the book. I have 14 pages of notes for this book, short bullet point notes, and a mere 1 page of those is included in this video. So most of the topics and aspects and things in the book I couldn't really carry over to the video. It is just a very brief introduction. As I mentioned before, the play that is included in the German edition wasn't very helpful for me, so you don't miss anything if you can't read the German version. The English version, Man's Search for Meaning, certainly has the better editions. Have you ever read Frankl's book? Or did you deal with logotherapy in any way? Please let me know in the comments. I'm looking forward to your feedback. Also, if you enjoyed the video, I would appreciate a like. And if you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the channel. I would be quite happy to have you as a subscriber. We will see each other next week with the next channel update. For today, I'll take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.